Didn't have to buy me.
Didn't buy you. Paid to stop watching.
They'll come for us. You'd kill for that?
No. Just won't run again.
By noon, the heat sank low and stayed there. A dull weight settled over canvas awnings and butcher's block. The square smelled of onions and old blood of horse sweat, and lamp oil, a thickness that settled at the back of the throat. Stray dogs circled the meat stall near the livery, and flies freckled the corners like soot that wouldn't brush off. Men bargained for salt pork and cracked boots, the way they might bargain for a fence post or a nail-measured board never gentle. Rowan Pike tied his gelding to a warped rail by the watering trough, and didn't bother with a knot. Dust held the animal quiet, as any rope would. He moved slow boots, thudding in an even cadence, the kind of pace that left no ripples. The hat brim shaded his eyes. His face kept its weathered, unreadable set. Old habits from the cavalry had a way of hollowing a man to essentials: scan for exits, don't crowd a corner, give yourself a way out. He heard the change in the market before he saw it. In Arroyo Ford, sound never vanished. It leaned, then men followed the lean. Somewhere between the tannery stall and the wheelwright's lean, to the pitch fell the chatter thinned, and a ring of bodies drew tight around some small, mean center. Rowan knew that shape. He stepped around a pail of offal and came up to the half-circle of men. No laughter in their faces, which was worse. A bored cruelty hummed there, men idling at the edge of something they did not intend to stop. Inside the ring stood a woman with her wrist roped in rawhide hair caught in her mouth, from the wind deerskin dress torn at the neckline and split down one side so that her ribs showed like pale slats. The handler beside her wore a whip looped to his belt and a slip of paper in his hand. He read the terms loud, the way one reads a docket or a sales bill, a dead man's debt stamped across the living. Rowan's eyes made the pass. They always made faces first hands, next the nearest reach, to iron the narrowest space to step through. He didn't feel surprise. He felt the old stillness arrive and settle. He went forward without brushing a shoulder, without clearing his throat. "How much?" he said, quiet but not soft. The handler blinked at Rowan's height, glanced down at the sidearm under his open coat, then at the butcher's knife strapped low on Rowan's belt, the kind of blade that skinned hogs clean and did other work if a night went sideways. The man started on about contracts and signatures. Rowan reached into his coat, pulled a folded stake, and counted until the words ran out. He did not haggle. He did not ask. He paid what shut a mouth. When the bill stopped moving, the rope fell. The woman looked at him then. Not grateful, not pleading. A steady look sharp as flint under dust. At her temple, a thin crust of dried blood caught the light. Her lips were cracked. The skin at her throat held the faint twist of the rawhide. "Name," Rowan said. "Nieli," she answered, voice rough but whole. He pulled the cork from his canteen and put it in her hand. She drank in small, deliberate swallows, not wasting a drop. He lifted his coat from the saddle and laid it over her shoulders without touching skin. Then he looked once at the ring of men. They found their boots fascinating. The space parted the way brush parts for a creek. They started walking. No plan spoken. No bargain struck. The square fell behind them with its flies and knives and the clack of a scale. As they passed the store missus, Reyes stepped out with sleeves rolled to the elbow, eyes like a hawk's. She didn't say a word. She pushed a folded woolen shawl into Rowan's hand. He took it. She gave a small nod, the kind reserved for things that are not new, only happening again. The road north ran between dun-colored rises, the track cut into clay like a scar. Wind lifted the dust in thin ghosts that crossed their path and vanished. The gelding blew once and settled into the climb. Sun sank slow toward the hills, washing the world in a brass light that made every nail and thorn look sharper. They rode without speaking. Words seemed wasteful in that hour. The market stink thinned. The air took on the dry metallic scent of cold, sneaking in early. Somewhere a hawk cried the sound, falling and falling until the silence took it. When the last roofs of Arroyo Ford dropped out of sight, Rowan slid the shawl from under his arm and held it out. Nieli drew it close, the wool heavy at her throat. Her braid had loosened in the wind. A strand clung to the edge of her mouth. She didn't smooth it back. She kept her hands where he could see them, palm open to the horn, the rope burn on her wrist, dark as smoke. The country widened. A line of cottonwoods marked a cut of water that only ran in spring. Beyond that, a single chimney smudged the air. The house was small enough to hide behind one of the cottonwoods, one room with a lean-to clinging like a tired shoulder. Fence posts lay in a rough pile by a half-built corral. Behind the tree, 2 wooden markers stood at a slight tilt, uncarved, the grain silvered by seasons. Rowan dismounted and looped the reins. He opened the door with the careful, habitual touch of a man who has learned not to jar a latch. Warmth pushed out first, the breath of a stove that had been banked and coaxed back then, the smell of beans, old coffee drywood, and iron. He set a kettle on the lip of the stove and pointed to the basin. "Water's warm," he said. She moved to the basin without asking for privacy, turned her back to the room, and washed in the methodical way of someone who saves heat and does not spill what costs. He found bread and broke it, set it beside the tin of salt, tore small pieces, and waited for her to sit. They ate like people who have been hungry enough to understand the work of chewing. When they were done, he spread a bedroll near the wall and laid a folded shirt across it. She looked at the shirt, then at the torn edge of her dress. She did not speak. She threaded a needle with steady fingers and set to mending. The stitches weren't fine, tight, uneven, strong. He stoked the fire and listened to the small domestic sounds return to the room, cloth against cloth, the soft click of a tin's lid, the stove's iron settling as heat thickened. Outside wind shouldered the corners of the house. A board on the lean-to gave a tired complaint. He crossed the room and set his knife on a crate between the 2 bedrolls, the handle turned toward her. It was a thing said without saying, the line between them marked and offered. In the near dark, the house changed its size. Daylight makes everything smaller. Night lets the distances inside a room grow. Rowan lay on his side with the rifle within reach and watched the orange seam where the stove door leaked a little light. He listened for the shift that meant fear, the catch of breath that meant a dream had got its teeth into someone. He heard only the long, slow discipline of a woman who had learned to rest with one ear open. At some hour he couldn't name when, put its palm flat against the north wall and pressed. The stove ticked. She sat up, quick hand going to the knife, and he said from the dark, even low stove settling. She breathed out and lay down again. The quiet after that wasn't empty. It had weight, like 2 people learning a rhythm by counting together in their heads. Dawn crept in thin and colorless, a pale wash through chinks where the boards did not kiss. Cold pooled at the floorboards first, then climbed. Rowan was awake before it, the way a man wakes when he has taught himself not to dream past danger. He didn't move. He listened to water pour from kettle to basin to cloth wrung tight to the hush of a shirt pulled over a shoulder. "You sleep loud," she said at last, not accusing, not amused. He struck a match and coaxed the fire back. Coffee would be thin, bread thinner, but both would be warm. He set a small bag on the crate. 44 cartridges, a folded scrap of paper, a penknife dulled by work. "If I'm long," he said, "use what makes sense." She didn't touch the bag. She pulled the shawl closer and stared at the stove's thin ribbon of light. The rawhide mark at her wrist had risen angry and dark in the new light. Outside, the sky had gone the color of pewter. Snow would come, maybe only a dusting, the kind the wind eats in an hour, but it would come. He took up the axe and split wood while she stacked it. She wiped each piece with her sleeve as if clean wood burned cleaner. When she swept the corners, she worked from the door inward, careful to leave herself a straight line out. He noticed and said nothing. By midday, the silence had altered. It wasn't wary now, not exactly. It had the feel of a truce marked by chores. He brought her a spool of thread and a needle he hadn't used in months. She glanced at the gift, then at her dress. "I used to sew better," she said. "Better than me," he answered, and checked the sky. Late afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge. Old Tomas bent like a question mark in the saddle scarf, crooked hat low. He swung down and set a wrapped cut of meat on the step. "Goddamn fool thing you done," he said, not unkindly. Rowan didn't argue. "She's Apache Tomas," went on, wiping his nose with the back of a glove. "Town won't let it lie. And Sutton's kennel rattle paper till a judge coughs. She's not property. Tell them that. Tomas jerked a thumb at the horizon. They'll come. Day or 3. Inside, Nieli stood with her back close to the hearth, shoulders squared chin level. She accepted the parcel with a nod. When Tomas left, Rowan watched the line of hills until the horse was a dark dot, and then less than that. Only after full dark did he speak from the window, still looking out graves out back. Wife and boy. Fever. 3 winters. She didn't flinch. Mine was shot, she said. Men like those in town. They said debt. No more words after that. Wind rested its forehead against the roof and muttered. He checked the latch twice. She moved her bedroll half a foot closer to the stove, close enough that the heat was shared without touching, and when the iron popped and ticked, she did not reach for the blade. The first snow arrived by midnight. It sifted down like dust, soft and persistent, and found the seams in the roof, the way water always finds a way. The house took the sound and held it. He lay there awake longer than he needed to, counting her breaths, and hearing inside each one the shape of a chain. Not a large one, not the kind a man could point at. Enough. Morning would set its dull light under the door. The axe would lift and fall. The judge's name, the handler's whip, the town's paper, those things would come knocking soon enough. But for now, the stove's glow ran in a thin ribbon across the room, and in that light, 2 strangers learned the first rule of staying: let the other person keep their name, keep a knife, and keep the quiet. The storm that had crept in overnight left only a faint crust on the ground, a scatter of white, tracing the fence line like salt spilled on earth. The air smelled of iron and pine smoke, a clean cold that made sound carry further than it should. Rowan Pike was already outside when the light came stacking the last of the split wood by the lean-to. He worked without hurry. The rhythm's steady lift-turn set his breath, rising in small cloud. When he came back in, she was kneeling by the stove, hair braided again, his shirt hanging loose over the patched deerskin dress. She had boiled water and scrubbed the basin. The shawl Mrs. Reyes had given her hung on the wall peg, not around her shoulders. It was the first morning she hadn't worn it. Rowan poured thin coffee into 2 tin cups. She didn't ask for one. He didn't ask if she wanted it. They drank in silence until the frost on the window melted into small, clear beads and began to slide down. "You ride much?" he asked finally. "Used to," she said. "Before I married. Before we owed." He nodded. That was all. Words between them still moved like animals in a trap, careful, half-starved, uncertain they'd be let go once spoken. The cabin sat on a shallow rise, and from its door a man could see the cottonwood tree, the half-built corral, and beyond that the stretch of pale hills where nothing moved but wind. Inside, the room had begun to look less like a refuge and more like a place being lived in. The coat he had given her hung beside the stove. The crate they'd used as a table now held 2 cups, a bowl, and a length of thread wound neatly around a nail. Small order, small claim. By midday she was sweeping the floorboards with a bunch of dried sage tied at the ends. The scent filled the air sharper than any candle. He watched from the doorway, his shoulder to the frame, his hands empty. "You can rest," he said. "I do this," she answered. "It helps me breathe." Outside, the wind dropped. A thin blue smoke climbed straight from the chimney, a rare stillness. They worked side by side most of the day, not speaking. She sorted the firewood he split, stacking by size, her hands red from the cold but steady. When she lifted a log, he noticed the faint tremor along the rawhide mark at her wrist. The skin had begun to heal, the bruise fading from purple to the color of old tea. In the afternoon, a dog appeared, no one's ribs sharp under fur. It hovered by the fence until Rowan whistled low. The animal crept forward, tail flat, eyes wary. Nieli stepped out with a scrap of bread. She crouched, arm out, still as a post. The dog sniffed, took the bread, then backed away, chewing fast. "Most things come here hungry," she said. Rowan looked at her a long moment. "Most stay that way." She didn't answer. She only turned back to the house, pulling the shawl from the peg and shaking the dust from it before laying it near the fire to dry. That evening, as the sky bruised purple and gold, the two sat across from each other at the crate again. The beans simmered thick and slow, and the only sound was the pop of a knot burning inside the stove. He had set his rifle against the wall, his knife on the crate, the handle pointed toward her habit. Now, not gesture. When they finished eating, she leaned forward, elbows on knees. "The men in town," she said quietly. "They will come." He nodded once. Tomas said the same. "They'll bring papers. I've seen worse than ink." She studied him. "Worse doesn't make it right." He met her gaze across the glow. "No, but it makes a man ready." They left it there. Later, while she washed the tin bowls, he stepped outside to check the night. Clouds had moved in from the west, low and fast. The dog lay curled under the porch, a patch of white in the dark. From inside came the soft scrape of cloth, her movements light but constant, like a rhythm meant to hold the house together. He looked toward the two graves behind the cottonwood. The wind ran a hand through the dry grass, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw her shadow beside his small, and exact. Both of them pointed the same way. When he came back in, she had spread her bedroll a little closer to the stove again. The knife still lay on the crate. He set his hat on the peg above hers and sat down, untying his boots. "If they come," she said, "you will stand for me. I bought you out," he answered. "That's different." "No," she said softly. "It's not." The words hung there, caught in the same space as the sound of the wind outside. He looked up, and for the first time since the market, he saw her face without the film of fear that had been living there. Only fatigue. Only a woman waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. He didn't promise her anything. He only said, "We'll keep the fire fed." And for now, that was enough. The snow came heavier the next night. It wrapped the cabin in a muted hush, turning even the wind into something gentle. Rowan rose before dawn and opened the door to find the dog sitting guard by the step-nose dusted white. The animal wagged once, almost shy, and followed him to the woodshed. When he came back, Nieli was already awake, stirring the ashes into flame. She looked at the snow, at the slow curl of smoke outside, then at him. "First snow," she murmured. He nodded. "You ever seen it fall quiet like that?" She smiled faintly, just enough to change her face. "Only once. The year I married." The kettle hissed. The dog barked once at nothing, just to hear the sound. Inside, the fire's glow stretched wider than before, touching the corners that had stayed dark since she came. For the first time, the cabin looked less like shelter from a storm and more like the start of a home. By the third morning, the snow had turned to a crust that cracked under boots and glittered in the slanted light. The silence of it made every sound deliberate: the click of a cup on the table, the scrape of a chair, the soft bark of the stray dog when it dreamed. Rowan had gone out early, cutting a new path through the drifts toward the corral. The fence stood half-built rails stacked like bones waiting to be joined. When he came back, the smell of cornmeal cakes met him at the door. Nieli stood at the stove, hair-coiled face flushed from the heat. She turned, handed him a plate without looking too long. They ate by the window. The sun found the frost and turned it to bright glass, dazzling enough to make him squint. "They still haven't come," she said. "They will," he answered. "Paper men always ride slower than bullets." She set her fork down. "And when they do, then we'll learn if ink is worth a gun." It was close to noon when the first rider appeared, a man in a derby hat coat, neat as ink. Two others followed, one carrying a rifle too loose, one smiling like he already owned the place. They dismounted before the porch boots sinking in the thawing snow. Nieli was by the fire, the dog growling low at her feet. Rowan opened the door before they could knock. "Morning," said the man in the hat, breath clouding. "We're here on behalf of Sutton and Co. to resolve a matter of property." "No property here," Rowan said. "Paper says otherwise." The man held up a folded document, seal half smudged. "Widow of one, Jonatena, owes 6 months of labor or equivalent in cash value." "She's paid," Rowan said. The man smiled thin. "Did she sign?" "Doesn't need to. Law says she does." Rowan stepped out onto the porch. "Law don't own what's already free." Behind the men, the dog had come forward, fur bristled. It gave a low growl that rippled the quiet. The man with the rifle shifted his stance. "We'll come back with the justice," the hat man said. "Let the ink settle the talk." "Bring whoever you can carry," Rowan said. but you'll walk in, not ride." Something in his tone made the men glance at each other. The smile faltered. They turned their horses, muttering about fools and snow and wasted time. When the sound of hooves finally died, the silence that replaced it was heavier than before. Inside, Nieli stood by the stove, arms folded, eyes on the window. "They'll come back," she said. "I know, they'll come for us. Then we'll stand. You'd kill for that, no? Just won't run again." By late afternoon, the sky dimmed again, gray piled on gray. Rowan sat at the table, sharpening the skinning knife in slow strokes. Nieli mended the sleeve of his coat needle, dipping in and out with a small metallic sound. "You could leave," he said after a long while. She didn't look up. "And go anywhere the papers don't reach." "They always reach," she said. "You just stop running long enough to make them meaningless." He set the knife down. The edge gleamed thin and sure. "You believe that?" She nodded once. "You'll see." The dog barked sudden sharp. Both of them looked toward the window, but it was only a rabbit crossing the yard light, and fast. Still, Rowan went to the door and checked the latch again. When he turned, she was standing closer than before, the lamplight on her face, soft and steady. "My husband," she said, "quietly died, standing where you are. He didn't move. Here." "No," she said. "By a river. They said he owed." "He said he didn't. They shot him. Paper in his pocket when he fell." Her voice didn't break. It never needed to. "I buried him," she said. "Then I ran. I thought that was the end of debt." He reached for the coat she had been mending, folded it once, and set it beside her. "It ends here," he said. Nieli studied him for a long moment. "Until they write another paper. Then we burn it," he said. The next day broke cold again, sky colorless, air still. Rowan hitched the horse and rode toward town before dawn. He left the rifle in plain view across the saddle. Nieli stood at the door, watching, until he vanished beyond the ridge. The dog sat beside her tail, flicking once, twice. She whispered something in her own tongue, half prayer, half warning, and went back inside. She boiled water, scrubbed the table, fixed the latch he'd been meaning to tighten. The house smelled of cedar and smoke and bread. When she paused, she pulled a small pouch from her skirt, buckskin worn thin-tied with red thread. Inside, 2 beads and a scrap of cloth, old as grief. She held it in her palm for a long time, then tucked it back. Outside, the snow began again, light as ash. Rowan returned before sunset, shoulders dusted white. He set a wrapped parcel on the table, flower salt wire for the fence, and another piece of paper signed and stamped. "She's free," he said simply. "By whose word?" "The justice's. And Mrs. Reyes." Nieli's breath left her in a sound halfway between a sigh and a laugh. "So now I belong to no one." He met her eyes. Never did. For the first time since Arroyo Ford, she smiled, not wide, not easy, but real. She looked at the fire, then back at him. "You trust me now?" she asked. "I trusted you before." Her smile deepened, small and tired and warm. "Good," she said. "Then eat. You've ridden too far to talk sense." He sat, and for a moment the cabin felt larger, as if the walls had drawn breath again. The dog curled near the door, the wind eased, and outside snow kept falling quiet, steady, covering the tracks of men who measured worth in ink and ownership. Inside, where no papers could reach, a man and a woman sat across from each other in the kind of silence that only the living can earn. The snow had hardened overnight, leaving a thin crust that cracked beneath the horses' hooves and glittered in the morning Sunday. The world was bleached, quiet sky, like pewter ground, like bone. In that stillness, even breath seemed loud. Rowan Pike had learned to tell time by silence. In the months since the market, he'd come to know the particular hush of dawn on Wind Hill, the soft groan of the cottonwood, the whisper of snow slipping off the lean-to roof, the single bark of the stray dog who had long since claimed to the porch as home. Each sound meant life was still where it should be. When he stepped outside that morning, frost dusted the stacked firewood. He touched the top log, checking for dampness. His gloves creaked with the motion leather stiff from the cold. The air smelled faintly of cedar smoke, of something clean and promising beneath the long rot of winter. Inside, Nieli was already awake. He could hear her movements, the gentle scrape of the poker, the kettle lid rattling once, the soft hum. She sometimes forgot she made when she worked. She'd begun to hum more these days, and though the melody had no words, it carried the slow pulse of peace. When he came in, she was standing at the stove, stirring the pot. Her braid hung loose, a few strands curling around her jaw. The firelight caught the small silver scar at her temple, the one he'd noticed the first night in the cabin. "Cold?" she asked, not turning. "Less than yesterday," he said, setting his gloves on the peg beside her shawl. "Sky's holding, though. Might stay clear." She nodded once. The air between them had changed since the day he brought the signed paper from town. The edges had softened. The quiet they shared no longer pressed against them. It stretched instead, giving room to breathe. They ate in the slow way of people who had run out of hurry. Cornmeal cakes, coffee so thin, it might as well have been memory. Outside, the dog pawed the door twice, then settled again, satisfied with the routine. "It's too still," Nieli said after a while, glancing at the frost melting along the window. "Snow like this never holds quiet." Rowan looked up. "Still air means change." "What kind?" he shrugged. "The kind that walks." Change came by mid-afternoon. It started as a sound faint enough to doubt metal striking stone, a rhythm out of place. Then came the shape, small and uneven, moving along the ridge road. Rowan stepped out onto the porch hand, shading his eyes. Through the glare of white, a mule staggered down the trail, steam rising from its flanks. Something small slumped in the saddle. "Rider," he called back into the cabin. Nieli joined him at the doorway, eyes narrowing against the light. Too small for a man. By the time they reached the fence line, the mule had stopped, sides heaving. The figure on its back was no bigger than a child. Rowan caught the reins, steadying the animal as Nieli reached up. The child slid sideways into her arms, lights stiff, with cold lips blue. "God," Nieli whispered, "she's half frozen." They carried her inside. Rowan laid her by the stove while Nieli stripped the sodden layers away. 2 furs, a man's coat boots, far too large. The girl's skin was white as paper, her lashes crusted with ice. "Get the kettle," Nieli said. Her voice was calm, practiced. "Blankets, anything dry." Rowan moved fast. Within minutes, steam filled the room, damp and sweet with cedar. Nieli bathed the girl's hands and face, rubbed warmth back into the small, clenched fingers. The dog whined, low tail thumping uncertainly. After a time, the girl stirred. Her lips parted. A rough whisper escaped. He said, "Come here." The man with the stitched coat. Rowan froze. "Old Tomas." The child nodded weakly. "He didn't wake up this morning." A long quiet followed, broken only by the kettle's soft hiss. Nieli looked up at Rowan, eyes shadowed with understanding. "He sent her," she said. He nodded. He knew we'd take her in. Nieli brushed a damp strand from the child's forehead. "What's your name, little one?" The girl's eyes fluttered, opened, the faintest spark of life behind them. "Clara," she whispered. They kept her by the fire that night. Nieli brewed broth from the last bones in the pot and fed her spoonful by spoonful until she slept again. Rowan sat close enough to watch the slow rise of her chest. The storm outside pressed hard against the walls, but the fire held. "She'll live," Nieli said softly. He nodded. Tomas must have known he was dying, sent her here, knowing the trail. "She's not kin," Nieli said, not as a question. "No, but she's breathing, and that's reason enough." Nieli's gaze lingered on the small face turned toward the light. "You'll bury him when the ground softens, I will." Silence again, the kind that wasn't empty. Nieli pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and leaned against the wall. "You think she has anyone?" "Not anymore." "Then she'll stay." Rowan looked at her. "You sure? Don't ask me if I'm sure," she said. "I'm still here, aren't I?" The days that followed blurred into a gentle pattern. Snow continued to fall, but softer now, flakes thin as ash. The cabin filled with the kind of noise that makes a house reel water poured into a basin, a small cough, the scratch of a spoon against a tin bowl. Clara regained color, then curiosity. She followed Nieli like a shadow, watching the way she folded cloth, the way she tested the stove's heat with the back of her hand. When Rowan came in from chopping wood, the girl greeted him with shy eyes and a piece of bread she'd torn in half to share. He knelt beside her once and asked, How old are you? She held up one hand, then 3 fingers on the other. 8, he guessed. 7, she corrected. 7's old enough to help, he said. You can feed the dog. The smile she gave him was small but fierce. One evening, Nieli found her braiding the dog's fur beside the hearth. The animal sat perfectly still, as if understanding it had been claimed. Can we keep him? Clara asked. Nieli's lips curved slightly. You'd have to ask him that. Does he have a name? Not yet. Clara thought for a moment, then said Snow. From the doorway, Rowan answered. That's a poor name for something that bites. Clara jumped startled, then giggled. He likes it. Rowan crouched, scratched the dog behind the ear. Then, Snow it is. Nieli's glance met his over the child's head, a quiet exchange that said more than words could. For the first time since the market, she smiled fully. That night, while Clara slept under a heap of quilts, Nieli sat at the table sewing patches on the girl's dress. Rowan carved a plank of cedar he'd salvaged from the old fence. Each stroke of the knife left a curl of pale wood on the floor. For names, he said when she looked up. She set her sewing down. Ours, he said simply. He carved Rowan, then Nieli, and finally Clara, spacing them evenly, the letters plain but sure. When he finished, he ran a thumb over the cuts, smoothing the splinters. It's good, she said. Strong. Cedar outlives seals and stamps, he said. She smiled faintly. Maybe that's the better law. They sat there a while in the warmth, the firelight flickering across the plank. Outside the world was all white and shadow. Days stretched longer after that. Clara recovered fast. By the 3rd morning she was already sweeping the cabin with a stick broom Nieli had cut down to her size. Her small voice filled the room in bursts, questions, stories, half-sung songs she must have learned somewhere south of the ridge. Rowan built a new bunk against the far wall. Nieli helped holding the boards steady as he nailed them into place. She'll need her own bed, he said. And you'll need more wood, Nieli replied. He looked up at her, saw the trace of a smile. You planning to stay long enough to burn it? I think I already have. Outside, the dog barked at nothing, a quick echo against the hills. The sound didn't frighten Clara. She laughed, the bright, startled kind that fills every empty space in a room. By late afternoon, clouds thickened again. Snowflakes spun sideways in the wind, fast and fine. Rowan went out to bring in more wood, and when he turned back toward the cabin, he saw them through the window. Nieli and Clara sitting close by the stove, the girl leaning into the woman's side as she threaded a needle through a torn hem. The sight stopped him cold, not from sorrow, not from shock, just from the simple, unbearable quiet of it. For a heartbeat, he wanted nothing more than to stay in that doorway forever outside, but near the smell of smoke and snow and warmth in his chest. He came in silently, brushing frost from his coat. Fence'll hold another storm, he said. Nieli nodded. Good. We'll hold 2. He set the wood down, crouched beside the sleeping girl, and adjusted the quilt over her shoulder. Her breath came even and deep. Maybe that's what freedom sounds like, Nieli said softly, behind him someone sleeping and not afraid. Rowan looked at her. Maybe that's what home sounds like. The fire popped, sending a brief spray of sparks up the flue. Outside, the snow thickened, erasing the old tracks from the yard, the ones that led back toward Arroyo Ford, toward the market, toward the men who spoke of debts and names written on paper. By morning, those tracks would be gone. Only the new ones, small, steady, belonging to a girl, a woman, a man, and a dog, would remain. And in that small cabin under a hill of wind, the world for the first time in a long while felt like it had stopped running. The thaw came slow that year, as if the land itself didn't yet trust warmth. Each morning brought a crust of frost that cracked under boot heels, and each afternoon melted it back to mud. The days had grown longer, light staying just enough to paint the sky pale gold before dusk, and the smell of thawing earth began to mix with the smoke from the cabin stove. Rowan Pike rose early, as always, the habit of a soldier of a man who had once slept under open skies with danger at his back. Now, when he opened the cabin door, the only thing that greeted him was silence, a good silence, a living one. Inside, Nieli stirred awake beside the stove, the shawl slipping from her shoulders. Clara slept on the cot hair, tangled, one arm flung across the quilt. The dog Snow lay between them, snoring softly. For a moment, Rowan stood still, watching the way the morning light caught on the curls of Nieli's braid and the curve of the girl's cheek. He didn't say it out loud, but the thought came clear as any prayer. This is what stays. He stepped outside. The air had that heavy pre-snow feel. It made him look to the horizon, even when he doesn't know why. The corral was finished now, the rails tight and even. Inside it, the mare pawed the ground, restless from the smell of a storm. Rowan fed her from the grain sack, checked the latches twice, then turned toward the ridge. That's when he heard it, the faint, rhythmic crunch of hooves. Not the lazy plod of a neighbor's mule, but a steady, deliberate ride. He straightened, eyes narrowing against the light. 5 riders coming from the east. By the time they reached the yard, Nieli was already at the door. She didn't ask how many. She didn't need to. Her hands moved fast, pulling Clara from her cot, whispering low, "Stay behind the stove. Don't move till I say." The girl obeyed without a sound. Rowan came in, jaw tight. He moved with the quiet precision of a man who'd been here before, the kind of stillness that comes right before the first shot. He checked the rifle by the door. Then the old shotgun Tomas had left him. The dog growled, low fur standing along its spine. "They're here," Rowan said simply. Nieli nodded once. "The paper men worse," he said. "Men who think the paper's theirs to write." Through the frosted window, the riders were visible now, 4 in worn coats and wide hats, the 5th wearing silver spurs that caught the light, the kind of shine that meant vanity or cruelty or both. Rowan stepped onto the porch. His coat hung open, his hands empty. The snow underfoot gave way with a sound like breaking glass. "You, Rowan Pike," the man with the spurs called out. "Depends who's asking. Name's Keen. We're here on behalf of the fort. You got something belongs to us." Rowan didn't blink. "I got a house, a fence, and a day's peace. That what you're claiming?" The man smirked. "Apache woman named Sonny. Escaped from federal holding. Ran this way last week. We tracked her cousin to this ridge." Rowan's eyes hardened. "She's not here. Maybe not now," Keen said. "But the law don't forgive harboring." Behind him, Nieli stepped into the doorway. Her hair was unbound, her eyes dark as the storm behind the hills. "She's blood to me," she said evenly. "She came half dead. You'd let her die for a paper?" Keen turned toward her, grin widening. "You one of them, then. Thought Pike here had better taste." Rowan's rifle rose before the words finished leaving the man's mouth. "That's far enough." The air snapped tight. Snow began to fall again, fine, fast. It hid movement, not intent. "Easy now," Keen said, spreading his hands. "We ain't here to hang nobody. Just doing the work the law won't dirty itself with." "Then you can go home clean," Rowan said. The standoff might have lasted forever, if not for the shotgun crack that split the air. The blast came from the cottonwood. Snow burst from the trunk where the shot hit, and the echo rolled down the ridge. Every man froze. Mrs. Reyes stepped out from behind the tree, her apron dusted white, her hair tied back in a red kerchief. The shotgun rested firm against her shoulder. "That's close enough," she called. "Town don't want your kind stirring dust up here." Keen's smile thinned. "You got no badge, woman." "No," she said, "but I got better aim than the one who does." The men shifted, uneasy. Rowan took a single step forward. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "This land's paid for by hands, by graves, by every cold night we've lived through. You want to test the deed, go dig for it under the snow." Something in the way he said it made even the horses flinch. Keen hesitated. The snow was falling harder now, sticking to his coat, dulling the shine of his spurs. He spat once into the slush, then swung back into his saddle. "This ain't over, Pike." Rowan met his eyes. "It is if you want to live." The riders turned. Their silhouettes blurred into the white until they were nothing but shapes swallowed by storm. When the sound of hooves faded, the silence that followed felt too big for the cabin walls. Nieli exhaled slow, her shoulders trembling only after the danger had passed. Inside, Clara crawled out from behind the stove and ran straight into her arms. Mrs. Reyes lowered the shotgun and stepped up onto the porch. "You owe me bread," she said. Rowan managed a tired smile. "You'll have it by sundown." Nieli looked at the older woman. "Thank you." Reyes waved the words off. Don't thank me. Just keep feeding that man till he remembers he's human." Then she gave them both a look, a long, appraising look that felt half blessing, half warning, and trudged back toward town before the trail froze again. That night, the cabin was warm. The fire burned high, the dog curled under the table, Clara fast asleep.